Right now, as you watch this, Brent crude sits above $110 a barrel. 5 weeks ago, it was $72. The reason is a 5-mile strip of coral in the Persian Gulf that most Americans have never heard of, and it just got hit again. Kharg Island handles 90% of Iran's oil exports. The U.S. military struck it in March. 90 precision targets, naval mines, missile bunkers, air defenses, all destroyed. The oil infrastructure was deliberately left standing. That was the warning shot. Today, hours before a presidential deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, new explosions rocked Kharg again. The damage assessment is still developing. Iran's Revolutionary Guard responded with a direct threat. They will deprive the U.S. and its allies of the region's oil and gas for years. Here's what you need to understand. This is not a distant military operation. This is the single most important choke point in the global energy system under active military pressure. 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. The strait has been effectively closed since early March, and the island that could bankrupt Iran's entire war machine is now under repeated bombardment. The price you pay at the pump this week is being set on that island right now. The escalation path here follows a precise sequence. In late February, U.S. and Israeli strikes hit Iranian military targets. Iran responded by closing the Strait of Hormuz to any vessel without explicit permission from Tehran. That single move removed roughly 20% of global oil transit from the market overnight. Brent crude crossed $100 a barrel on March 12th. The next day, the U.S. launched its first massive strike on Kharg Island. 90 military targets destroyed in nearly 2 hours of nonstop bombardment. The oil terminals were spared. The message was clear. Open the strait, or the oil infrastructure goes next. Iran did not open the strait. Instead, Tehran reinforced the island. Man-pad air defense systems moved in. Traps were laid across landing zones. Artillery and rocket systems repositioned along the mainland coast just 20 miles away. Iran's parliament speaker publicly warned that any attempt to occupy one of Iran's islands would trigger attacks on every piece of energy infrastructure belonging to U.S. partners in the region. The U.S. responded by deploying Marine Expeditionary Units and elements of the 82nd Airborne to the Gulf. Brent pushed past $111. Diesel hit $5.40 a gallon, the highest in real terms in over 2 years. And the White House set a deadline, 8 p.m. Eastern, tonight, for Iran to reopen the strait. But this is where the story changes. Because what happens at Kharg Island tonight does not stay at Kharg Island. Here is what happened in the last 72 hours. On Sunday, OPEC Plus agreed to increase production by 206,000 barrels per day starting in May. Under normal conditions, that announcement would push prices down. It did nothing. The oil has nowhere to go. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the UAE have shut in production because they cannot ship it. On Monday, Trump doubled down. He told reporters the U.S. could destroy every bridge and power plant in Iran within 4 hours, that it would take Iran 100 years to rebuild. Brent ticked up another point. Then overnight, new strikes on Kharg. Multiple explosions reported by Iranian state-affiliated media. The U.S. confirmed it hit dozens of military targets on the island again. Vice President Vance said it represented no change in strategy. But this is where the story changes. The IRGC issued its most direct threat yet, not a vague warning. A specific operational promise that all precautions regarding regional neighbors have been removed. Kuwait already got hit. Drone strikes damaged several Kuwaiti petroleum facilities over the weekend. The UAE, which Iran accuses of hosting the HIMARS launchers used against Kharg, is now directly in the crosshairs. Israel simultaneously struck petrochemical facilities inside Iran. Highways, railways, and civilian bridges across the country are being destroyed. Iran told its citizens to form human chains around power plants. This is not a contained military exchange. This is a regional energy war with no ceiling established and no off-ramp in sight. And the part most analysts are missing is what this does to the barrel math over the next 30 days. Kharg Island is not a military base. It is the financial spine of the Iranian state. 90% of Iran's crude exports load onto supertankers from its deepwater jetties. The island connects through underwater pipelines to Iran's largest oil and gas fields. One facility alone, Falat Iran Oil Company, produces 500,000 barrels of crude per day. Take Kharg offline, and you do not just damage Iran's military, you collapse its economy within weeks. The White House knows this. Internal assessments indicate that seizing or destroying Kharg's oil infrastructure would bankrupt the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. That is the strategic logic driving every decision right now. Not regime change, not territorial control. financial strangulation through energy denial. But the structural problem runs deeper than Iran. The Strait of Hormuz closure has already removed nearly 1 billion barrels from global supply in just over a month, 600 million barrels of crude, and 350 million barrels of refined products, according to TD Securities. Alternative pipeline routes exist, but none have been tested at scale. The Jask terminal on the Gulf of Oman was built as a bypass option. The International Energy Agency says it is not a viable export route for Iranian crude at current capacity. What this means for you is direct. This is not a temporary supply disruption. The physical infrastructure required to move oil around the Strait of Hormuz does not exist at the volume the global market needs. Every week the strait stays closed, the deficit compounds, and the deficit is already showing up at your gas station. Hold that thought, because what comes next changes everything about how long this lasts. Here is what the data actually shows about the decision-making on both sides. The U.S. is operating on a theory that economic pain will force Iran to capitulate quickly, destroy military assets on Kharg, threaten the oil infrastructure, set public deadlines, escalate pressure until Tehran calculates that reopening the strait costs less than keeping it closed. The flaw in that theory is that Iran has already absorbed the worst-case scenario in its own calculus. Tehran watched its air defenses get dismantled. It watched 90 military targets evaporate in a single night. It watched bridges, railways, and highways get destroyed across the country. And it did not blink. It reinforced. The IRGC moved more assets to Kharg, not fewer. It laid traps for a ground invasion it clearly expects is coming. That is not the behavior of a government preparing to negotiate. That is the behavior of a government preparing to absorb punishment and escalate in response. The deeper strategic read is this: Iran does not need to win a military confrontation. It needs to make the cost of occupation unbearable. Kharg sits 20 miles from the Iranian mainland. Every Marine on that island would be within range of rocket artillery, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and first-person view drones, the same technology that has destroyed helicopters and armored vehicles in Ukraine. One successful strike producing significant U.S. casualties changes the entire political equation in Washington overnight. This is the part most analysts are missing. The U.S. can take Kharg Island. Military experts across the board confirm that. The question nobody in Washington has answered is what happens when Iran does not stop fighting after they lose it. And that unanswered question is what is currently priced into every barrel of oil on the planet. But the other side tells a different story. The case for aggressive action on Kharg is not irrational. Proponents inside the administration argue that Iran's economy is already fracturing. Oil revenue funds the IRGC. Cut that revenue at the source, and the regime loses the ability to sustain asymmetric operations across the region within months. The logic is simple. Iran cannot fight a war it cannot fund. There is historical weight behind this argument. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, Saddam Hussein bombed Kharg repeatedly for exactly this reason. Iranian oil exports dropped from 2.5 million barrels per day to under 1 million. The economic pressure contributed directly to Iran accepting a ceasefire it had rejected for years. The pattern exists. Financial strangulation through energy denial has forced Tehran to the table before. The administration also points to the timeline. Every day the strait stays closed, global inventories drain. Allies grow restless. The political cost of inaction rises faster than the political cost of escalation. Seize Kharg, control the oil leverage, and Iran loses its only remaining card, the threat to destroy infrastructure it no longer holds. The precise gap in this argument is operational, not strategic. Seizing Kharg does not reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Iran retains asymmetric capability to mine the waterway, attack tankers with fast boats and drones, and strike Gulf state energy infrastructure from the mainland. The 1980s parallel breaks down at exactly this point. Saddam had a land border and an 8-year ground war applying pressure simultaneously. The U.S. has neither. Taking the island without a mechanism to force the strait open creates a military occupation with no exit condition. And that gap is what separates a strategic victory from a quagmire measured in American casualties and $150 oil. Here is where this reaches your daily life. Brent crude started 2026 at $61 a barrel. It now trades above $110. That is a 80% increase in under 4 months. The last time oil moved this fast was the first quarter of the 1973 embargo. The EIA confirmed last week that this is the largest inflation-adjusted price spike in their data going back to 1988. Gas prices are the first transmission mechanism. U.S. average retail gasoline hit $3.99 a gallon at the end of March. That number is climbing. The supply chain math is brutal. When crude rises by $10, retail gasoline follows by roughly 25 cents within 2 to 3 weeks. If Brent holds above $110 through April, you are looking at $4.25 to $4.50 at the pump by month end. If the strait stays closed into May, $5 gasoline becomes a realistic national average. Diesel is the second hit, and it is worse. Diesel closed March at $5.40 a gallon, the highest in real terms in over 2 years. Diesel moves freight. Every truck delivering groceries, building materials, and consumer goods to your local store runs on it. When diesel spikes, the cost embeds into every product on every shelf within 30 days. Food costs follow the same pipeline. Transportation accounts for roughly 12% of retail food pricing. A sustained diesel price above $5 adds measurable cost to every grocery trip you make. This is not theoretical. This is the supply chain timeline from every previous oil shock on record. Borrowing costs compound the damage. The Federal Reserve cannot cut rates into an energy-driven inflation spike. If oil stays elevated, the rate cuts the market expected this year evaporate. Mortgage rates stay high. Credit card rates stay punishing. Auto loans stay expensive. The relief American households were counting on from the Fed just got postponed indefinitely by a 5-mile island most people cannot find on a map. 2 scenarios from here. Both start tonight. Short term, next 30 to 60 days. If Trump's deadline passes without a deal, the probability of a ground operation on Kharg increases sharply. Marine Expeditionary Units and 82nd Airborne elements are already in theater. Central Command has the island under constant surveillance. The military is ready. If U.S. forces seize Kharg, expect Brent to spike past $120 within 48 hours on the initial shock, then settle between $115 and $125 as markets price in a prolonged occupation. Iran retaliates against Gulf state energy infrastructure. Kuwait has already been hit. The UAE is next. Saudi Aramco facilities come under direct threat. Gas prices in the U.S. breach $4.50 nationally within 3 weeks. Midterm, next 3 to 6 months. The escalation path leads to $130 to $150 oil if the strait remains closed and Gulf state infrastructure takes sustained damage. Nearly 1 billion barrels already removed from supply. TD Securities projects the deficit deepens every week with no viable rerouting mechanism. Demand destruction begins in Asia and Europe. Global recession indicators start flashing. The Fed holds rates or raises them into the shock. American household budgets absorb the worst energy cost squeeze since 2022. The de-escalation path requires Iran to accept a ceasefire framework that includes reopening the strait and verifiable limits on its nuclear program. The current signals suggest Tehran is not there yet. The IRGC has removed all restraint on regional targeting. Iran is preparing to absorb more punishment, not less. The diplomatic window exists, but it is narrowing by the hour. The pattern is clear. Every previous energy war in the Persian Gulf followed the same arc. Escalation moved faster than diplomacy until the economic damage forced both sides to the table. The question is not whether that moment comes. The question is how much damage accumulates before it does. What happens at 8 p.m. tonight sets the trajectory for oil prices, your gas bill, and the global economy for the rest of 2026. Subscribe now, because by the time this hits mainstream headlines, the market will have already moved.